a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, Memoir Nation listeners. If you haven't heard, we are hosting monthly classes at Memoir Nation featuring memoir writers and teachers who are experts in the genre and the craft. And we want to make sure you know about our next two courses because we have some really amazing memoirists who are teaching them. Maggie Smith is coming up in October, and Carvel Wallace is coming up in November. So, Brooke, I think these were two of our favorite books of the past couple of years, and now it's just so amazing that they're teaching for us.
Yeah, that's right. Maggie Smith is the author of You Could Make This Place Beautiful, and Carvel Wallace wrote Another Word for Love. And Maggie will be teaching about experimenting with form, which she did so beautifully in her own memoir. And Carvel is teaching about theme, also incredibly executed in his book. So you are in for a treat. These classes are just $49. And honestly, these are some of the most talented writers of our era. I do not even say that lightly. And they have so many wonderful insights. So we are inviting you to come check it out. Come join us. Mark your calendars, October 14th for Maggie Smith and November 4th for Carvel Wallace. Really, truly, these classes are going to be worth every penny.
Absolutely. So check out the details at memoirnation.com under the classes tab and explore what we're up to while you're there. You know, we're growing Memoir Nation each and every week. So if you're looking for community and writing advice and great classes and much more, come see what we're up to. And we hope to see you on October 14 or November 4, or for both, or for the classes after that as well.
Totally. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. Visit memoirnation.com. And now on to today's show.
Hello, optimists, screenwriters, enthusiasts, persisters, and believers. I'm Grant Faulkner, one half of this very optimistic podcasting duo, along with the noted greenlighter, Brooke Warner. And the reason I'm focused on optimism, and specifically on the moments we say yes to ourselves, you know, to our creativity, to our growth, to possible embarrassment, but also to great success, it's because Kwame Alexander is our featured guest today. And Kwame is a model of saying yes and dealing with many, many no's in life. And he's a model in both his life story, his writing story, his business story, and his growing as a human being story. And I love his quote that he's not a grown man, he's a growing man. And I'm fortunate enough that I've seen the power of his yes attitude up close, because I'm working with him as an executive producer of an upcoming TV show, America's Next Great Author, which I've mentioned before, but it actually has an air date now of January 2027. And I was actually on a writing retreat with him a year or so ago as he was working on a commencement address for American University. And that commencement address turned into a book that recently came out, Say Yes. And I have to say it was amazing and even kind of magical to hear Kwame try out a rough draft of the speech to a few of us, and then to listen to the speech, which is just so inspirational, especially for writers. So I recommend you get the book, Say Yes. You can also Google Kwame and American University, and you can watch the speech on YouTube, which I recommend. So Brooke, a couple of thoughts. When we recently talked at the Bay Area Book Festival about authorpreneurship, one of our talking points was about saying yes, which is crucial to any endeavor, whether you're writing a book, selling a book, or making a living as an author. And you've also written a book called Greenlight Your Book. And I was wondering how you personally see yourself saying yes in life. And I'm going to leave the question that broadly because I think there are so many different ways to say yes. And I like to think about how they are interconnected.
Yeah, I love this question, Grant, because saying yes is foundational to the origin story of this very podcast. I asked you to do this podcast with me, and we share this story a lot, that it was a somewhat reluctant yes that you gave, but here we are 8 years later. Saying yes is really important when you're starting out as an author because you never know what an opportunity, might lead to. For me, saying yes has been sort of a mantra. It's been a little bit automatic. I do think there are say yes people for sure, and that you and I are both that way. But it's always been about like stepping forward into the next opportunity, the next partnership, the next iteration of my business. It could be about speaking opportunities or, like I said, this podcast or writing books. And so historically, being a yes person, I've always seen that as a positive in the sense that it's opened doors for me, and that has extended into my personal life as well. I say yes yes to sports things, like the challenging day-long races that I used to do when I was younger, or my recent Alcatraz swim. It's also about embracing challenges and saying you're going to do something and following through with it. So it's fulfilling in that way as well. And saying yes is a mindset. And honestly, I think it's only recently, Grant, that I've gotten to a place in my life that I'm saying yes less just for my own sake, from a personal and professional capacity. And Kwame is going to speak to this at the end of his interview, which is great, because it's an orientation to life. But then I think you can also get to a place where you kind of have to start saying no for your own mental health. And I think that's been true for you too. But tell me what you think about it.
Yeah, it's funny. But I've always been a very yes-oriented person as well. Since I was a young kid, from my first memory, I was always cooking up new ventures and businesses and novels or whatever. I even wanted to be president of the United States when I was 3 or 4. I won't tell you when I stopped wanting to be president of the United States, but it was way too late in life. So I think I might have a gene that creates wildly delusional aspirations. But I think that's actually a valuable part of saying yes. I think like dreaming too big, dreaming as big as you go, and maybe not knowing or realizing that you can't do your dream. Kwame talks about that early in his life, how he was trying to make his first basket, and he wove in this theme that you make your first basket, but not knowing that you can't do it with each shot. You have to practice. So when it came to writing, that was a huge dream that was fueled by different types of delusion, because I can't remember many people encouraging me a lot, much as well. And very few, I think, said I was a good writer. So maybe I got a sign here or there, but there was a lot of rejection in between the here and there. And I don't know why I believed so much in myself. I just thought I could work my way into being a good writer. But I should let listeners know that while I published stories in literary journals and stuff, I didn't publish my first book until I was 50. And that's after expecting to have a wildly successful novel by the time I was 30, not younger, when I first set out to be a writer. And I don't know what drove me, except just waking up every day and saying yes, because being a writer is what I wanted to be, what I felt myself as in the very core of my being. And Kwame is interesting because he often calls himself a 26-year overnight success story, which I really like, because he was not a significant success, and he was facing down different kinds of failure or challenges at midlife. He had 2 children, and he made a big bet on a YA novel in verse for boys, which wasn't and isn't exactly a hot demographic for novels in verse. And he was rejected 23 times before a publisher accepted it. But he ended up winning the Newbery for it, and then an Emmy for the TV show that was based on the book. But just to round out the story of his success, on the day he found out that he was nominated for 2 Emmys, he got a call from an executive at Disney. And he thought it was going to be a congratulatory call, but the executive said, "I'm calling because we don't want you to get your hopes up. We're canceling your show." So that was a lesson. That's a lesson to us all, that no matter what success we have, somebody's no is oftentimes just around the corner. But back to yes, one thing that's interesting about Kwame is how he says yes to different genres of writing, which I think can be really challenging, not only as a writer to write in a different form, but in terms of marketing your work to a whole different demographic. And Kwame has amazing success as a children's book author, but he recently wrote a memoir, Why Fathers Cry at Night, which we're going to talk about with him. And I know you've had to say yes to your memoir in different ways, Brooke, but I don't know if we've ever talked about the fact that saying yes to your memoir is actually also a genre shift for you. You've written inspirational or instructional how-to nonfiction, and now you're writing something that's, obviously way more personal. So what went into saying yes to writing more personally, and how do you keep saying yes to it, that personal side of it?
Yeah, it's a good question, because something shifted for me probably 2-3 years ago when I realized that I finally felt ready for the memoir. For years, I was just not doing it, with the notion that someday I would write my story. I just wasn't sure when. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. And the specific shift I felt was a readiness. It was a feeling that I'd have enough distance from my own story. But then, as I have written about and talked about, my dad got sick and died. That was in May of 2023. the memoir went subterranean. I stopped working on it. And when I tried to bring it back to the surface, it wasn't saying yes, or we weren't saying yes to each other. But I do have to say, Grant, it was clear then and now that was just a break. I knew I'd come back to it. I just wasn't sure when. And just recently, it's been true that it's starting to call me. It's like, I'm here. I need to be written, because I've sort of projected this date that I would publish it in 2029 when my son graduates from high school. And so I think that these are moments that we all have, and maybe particularly with memoir, that saying no to your memoir is not a no forever, not a forever no. So I like to think of it as like a yes, but not right now, or a yes, but not yet, or a yes, but we're taking a break. And so I've made this commitment to myself. I feel like I'm dancing with it. And in the classes that we teach, I often talk about how you're in relationship with your memoir. And the way that I'm talking about it right now, clearly it's like, I'm saying yes, we're saying yes to each other, we're taking a break. And like any relationships, you're going to have highs and lows, and you're going to love your work, and you're going to get mad at it. And you spend a lot of time and energy on it, and then you'll take breaks. And so coming to peace with my memoir being on its own timeline was honestly really profound for me. But now that I have, a determined general publication timeline, I also don't want it to take up 10 years, and I don't want to come back to this conversation 5 years from now and be like, are you still working on that? So I'm definitely keenly aware that it's, in process, and then I'm picking it back up again. So I'm curious, Grant, and like, as I'm sharing all this about being in relationship with the book, does that resonate with you, on projects past and present?
Yeah, and Brooke, while you were talking, I calendared a date 5 years from now to to check back in with you, just so you know, just for accountability reasons. Yeah, I also did it for myself. I love this idea that you feel like you're dancing with your memoir, and if that's the operating metaphor, then sometimes I'm like a nerdy teen at a middle school dance with my back against the wall, essentially waiting for my memoir to ask me to dance. And sometimes I'm nervous to walk across the gym to ask it to dance. But sometimes it's flirting with me, sending me notes, and we have a raucous evening of dancing. So I could go on and on with this metaphor, and maybe I will, because you're right. Writing a book is a relationship that has highs and lows. It is if a new person is in your life that you're talking with. And a big part of any relationship is saying yes. So I want to think about that a bit more. I remember talking with the now best-selling romance author Jasmine Guillory once. And she said she'd spent her life talking herself out of writing a novel. So she decided to talk herself into one NaNoWriMo. And that's how she wrote her first novel, by saying yes to her dreams and talking herself into it. So I say this a lot, but I don't really think you can hear it too much as a writer. This mantra at NaNoWriMo we had was, your story matters. And I think it embodies the power of saying yes. If you don't say yes, you won't even recognize, or you say yes to yourself and your ideas, that you won't even recognize that you have a story to tell. You won't write the first word. You won't make it through the muddy middle. So the metaphor of dancing is spot on here. If you don't believe your story matters, you won't ask your memoir to dance. It's definitely a leap of faith, but that leap of faith has a safety net underneath it, and that's belief in yourself. Kwame quotes Maya Angelou in the book, and in his book, Say Yes, and she said, "You may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated. In fact, it may be necessary to encounter the defeats so you know who you are, what you can rise from, how you can still come out of it." And I think that even has like a sub-theme of your conversation with your memoir, Brooke, of going from no to yes at different times. And I say that idea of the necessity of encountering defeat, which reframes it, I just love that. And saying yes is so much about persistence, as Kwame illustrates in his story. But before we bring Kwame on, I want to ask you a question about a possible trend in memoir, Brooke. Kwame's memoir, Why Fathers Cry at Night, is told in the form of prose, poems, letters, and recipes, and it's a collage of sorts. And we've talked about hybrid memoirs, and I guess this is a hybrid memoir, but it's also a collage. I know some memoirs tell a story through recipes or books, these interesting markers of different eras in one's life. Do you see other memoirs like this, Brooke, of note that are like a collage?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I agree with you that it's a trend that we're seeing, and that it's maybe another name for what we're talking about as a hybrid memoir of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great visual memoir as collage. I do think, even though people aren't saying this about Carmen Maria Machado's work, that she's doing a version of what you're talking about, because In the Dream House uses other books and movies and cultural references to explain the history of domestic abuse. And I think she does that so as not to overwhelm her readers with only the story of her own abuse. And she does that to really great effect. And of course, a lot of memoirs have recipes in them. I love it when it makes sense. Sometimes I think people just like throw in recipes and it's a little off, but I'm thinking of The Language of Baklava by Diane Abu Jaber, which is a memoir and a love letter to her two cultures, American and Jordanian. And really, people have been doing interesting blendings for a very long time. And the permission that writers are giving themselves to make their memoirs themselves creative recipes is interesting to me, like collage or recipes, however, whatever visual works for you. And then there have been like explicitly very actual collage-y memoirs. And we've had two guests on, Mira Jacob and her book, Good Talk, and Faith Adiele, who wrote these two books that were in conversation with each other, Her Voice and Voice Over, which were in fact very collage-y in nature. So, nothing but creative blue skies over here, Grant, as you know, as our listeners know. And I love that we're tying together this notion of saying yes with permission to write the kind of memoir that you want to write, or the memoir that your memoir wants to be.
Well, we're going to find out more about Kwame's style of saying yes, so prepare to be inspired to say yes to a lot of things in your life after this. We'll see you after this very short musical interlude. Well, Brooke, I'm always so pleased when we have a sponsor whose products and services I've actually used and enjoyed independently, and that's the case with Gotham Writers Workshop. I took my first class with them nearly 20 years ago, and it was an online class, my first online class ever. And I had my MFA at the time, and I have to say that my Gotham class was as good as any of my MFA classes. And in fact, the great writer Manuel Gonzalez taught it. But it wasn't just about Manuel. All of the students in the course were super smart and really good writers. And amazingly enough, I'm still in touch with some of them. So I wholeheartedly recommend taking any of Gotham's courses.
I love that so much. And Gotham definitely has a high pedigree, and it's been around for a long time. They offer creative writing classes in New York City, but also over Zoom, and also asynchronous classes that you can take online. And so you can be anywhere in the world. And they have an amazing breadth of offerings, Grant. They offer memoir classes, woohoo, but also other nonfiction, as well as fiction, poetry, songwriting, and many others, and with super qualified instructors and for an affordable price.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, they are very much about community, so you can stay involved with Gotham in a number of ways, and they even put on conferences. And writers often ask me how to find a writing group or a beta reader, and I think taking a class is a great way to find good writing partner matches. So develop your craft and join a vibrant community of writers at Gotham Writers Workshop.
Yes, you can find them at gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting. Use our code, please, Memoir Nation at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply there, but definitely go check it out. And so endorse them, Grant.
Yeah. So one more time, visit gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting soon, and use the code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir and Nation with no space between them, at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them that Grant sent you, and Brooke too. Welcome back, everybody. I am super thrilled to introduce Kwame Alexander, and I'm going to need maybe 10 to 15 minutes to read his bio, but here goes. Kwame is an Emmy Award-winning producer. Whoa. Kwame, I didn't know you'd won an Emmy.
Of course you did. I've told everyone and taken it everywhere.
I might have seen a photo or two. Beyond that, Kwame is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 45 books, including the memoir Why Fathers Cry at Night, which we're going to talk about shortly, and Say Yes, which we're also going to talk about, and then The Crossover, his Newbery Medal-winning novel, which was turned into the Disney TV series. He's also the executive producer of Acoustic Rooster and his Barnyard band, and Acoustic Rooster, Jazzy Jams, a PBS Kids special, and a series of shorts produced by GBH Kids based on his beloved children's book of the same name. He regularly shares his passion for literacy, books, and the craft of writing around the world, including Ghana, West Africa, where he opened the Barbara E. Alexander Memorial Library and Health Clinic. He's a recipient of the 2025 NAACP Image Award. And he's also the artistic director of literary arts for the Chautauqua Institution and the founder of the new literacy nonprofit One Word at a Time, which is having a fundraiser we're going to tell you more about. And what isn't mentioned in his bio yet is that he's an executive producer on the unscripted TV show America's Next Great Author, which we hope you'll be able to see soon. Welcome, Kwame.
Thank you all so much for reading that very lengthy bio. I didn't write it.
There's so many good things in here, and you do so many different things in the world. So I had to read it all, definitely. Speaking of, because you say yes to a lot of things, obviously. Mm-hmm. When Brooke and I opened the show talking about our own history of saying yes. So that's our featured theme today because of your new book and your story. And I'm generally a say yes person, but it's a mysterious trait to me. I feel like I was born a writer and I was born a say yes person for the most part, but I'm not sure if I can even answer the why part of it because I've had, periods of my life where I was veering into being at least a sometimes say no person. So I was wondering about your history with say yes. Like, have you always seen yourself as a say yes person, or did you develop yourself into a say yes person? So just what's your relation to say yes in general?
When I was 3 years old, my parents were in graduate school at Columbia University. We lived in a place called Morningside Heights. And my father, the quality time that we spent together was on the playground. And he would take me to shoot baskets, to shoot free throws. My father was a pretty big basketball star in high school, college, and the Air Force. So he would take me to shoot free throws. Now, I was 3 years old, y'all. So I wasn't, I was pretty small. And so the ball would never go anywhere near the basket, I'm told. But he kept making me shoot it. And there was this playground supervisor who from time to time would come over with the big wrench to lower the goal. And my father would tell him, no, stop. Nobody lowers my son's goal. He doesn't know he can't make it.
That is so cool.
I think it's in my genes, y'all. I literally believe that, and my father will say this to this day, that I was an experiment. And he'll sort of chuckle. But I believe that this idea, this notion of saying yes, is something that I was born or near birth, nurtured with. I think about, we had our library was in our garage, and my dad had milk crates and maybe about 5,000 books. And from time to time, he would ask me to go and clean up the garage, which was also our laundry room and sort of our storage. And I couldn't wait. Sometimes I'd volunteer. I'm going to clean out the garage because I knew I could sort of, check out all the books and read the spines. And I found that really interesting. And so I really embraced this notion of cleaning up the garage. And inevitably, I would not finish. I would never finish. I'd get halfway done. And I knew this going into it. I don't think this idea of saying yes has ever stopped me, even when I've known or suspected that and which has been most of the time, that there's a risk this may not work out.
Right.
I think it's in my blood, y'all.
Well, it's so interesting, that story about your father, because I was thinking saying yes in some ways is a kind of, not knowing you can't make it is the definition, right? I remember my first basket. It was the same way. I sat around and shot probably 1,000 shots, before finally one went in.
But that's the practice that it takes.
Exactly. Yeah, good one. It's a perfect metaphor.
And I love the idea of being an experiment because clearly it worked out well. And Grant and I also both love this notion, Kwame, of calling yourself a 26-year overnight success story. And I did some math on that. You were in your late 40s. You had a wife and children, and your novel and verse, The Crossover, had been rejected 22 times. And you'd already spent your life saying yes in all these different ways. But at this age and in your circumstances of having to care for others, I'm just curious what you were going through in terms of saying yes in that moment. And were you ready to give up?
I was 44 when the book got published, and I was 45 when my life changed. I have a little brother. Hopefully he's not listening. And he's had a journey. and he's wanted to be successful. Everyone in my family are artists. My sisters and my brother were all artists. And I remember he was in his early 40s, and he was just having a rough time, just sort of making it, as it were, whatever that means for him. And he needed a job. And I said, I got a friend who owns a restaurant, and he's looking for waiters. And my brother got so upset with me. Why would you think I'd want to do that? That's what you think of me? I'm an artiste. Like, why? I can't believe you would think I should be a waiter. Like, it was so beneath him. And I remember saying to him, dude, when I was 44, I was laid off from my job. And I was I was selling books at a farmer's market to pay the rent. And looking in the classified sections for any job, temp job. And I had written like 15 books by then. So I was a writer in my mind, and I found myself having to sort of put my ego in check and sort of do what was necessary. What did Denzel Washington say in that movie where he was quoting the famous poet, who I can't remember his name, but he said, do what you gotta do so you can do what you wanna do. And my brother just didn't get it. And I have no idea what your question is, Brooke, but I hope I'm answering it. That
you never gave up.
I never gave up. I saw what I knew what needed to happen. And I knew that if I stopped shooting, I definitely wasn't going to make it. But that period of time when the crossover came out and I'd been laid off from my job and selling books at the farmer's market, I didn't know what was going to happen next. Like, I didn't know whether I'd have to go and wait tables or get a temp job. I just didn't know. But I also knew that I wasn't going to stop writing. I wasn't going to stop trying to promote my book. I wasn't going to stop pursuing this dream of being immersed fully into the writerly life and being able to provide for myself and my family. I knew I wasn't giving up on that. All the other stuff, I didn't know how it was going to play out, or when it was going to play out.
That's such a great story, especially because so many authors feel pressure to publish early in life. And if they haven't published early, they're not a real writer, or they don't have the skills to do it. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about the crossover and your play with form and redefining forms. You know, like I think it was 22 or 23 publishers that had rejected the crossover, something like that. You know, when I first found out about the crossover, I wouldn't have guessed there was a market for poetry-infused sports themes children's book because, you know, boys probably wouldn't read poetry and girls probably wouldn't read about sports. And I think when you came out with that book, there weren't many novels in verse. You kind of set a new trend. And you also played with form in your memoir, Why Fathers Cry at Night. And Jacqueline Woodson called it part cookbook, part jazz concert, 100% deep and moving love song of a memoir. And you told the story in the form of prose, poems, letters, and recipes. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about why you decided to shape your story this way, almost like a collage, and what part does a saying yes attitude play in these kinds of aesthetic decisions?
That's like a million questions in one. Well,
sorry, I'll try to simplify.
Hey, Brooke, can you translate for me?
I'll do it. How does say yes influence playing with form?
By way of explanation, I will say that I did not set a trend for novels in verse. That before me, there was Karen Hess, who wrote Out of the Dust and won a Newbery Medal for it. It was a novel in verse about the Depression. There was Anne Berg, who'd written All the Broken Pieces. There was Walter Dean Myers, who had written 125th Street. There was Sonia Sones. There was Sharon Creech, who'd written Love That Dog. But to your point, and I don't know if this means anything, there had never been a book that focused on sports. I mean, All the Broken Pieces was about a kid who loved baseball, but I think basketball in the crossover became sort of the frame. It became the metaphor, in addition to sort of the literal, a big portion of the plot. So I think in that regard, it was, and it featured a boy. And so, it was a little different. But I don't know if I set a trend, but I sort of opened up a world, I think, in a way that the next year there were like 23 novels in verse published. Mm-hmm. So I get what you're saying about that. As it relates to the memoir, dude, my contract with Little Brown was for a book of love poems. So I was living in London at the time, and it was a pandemic, and I had nothing to do but write. And I was writing love poems. I was writing about family and love and friendship. I mean, that's sort of how I started my career, y'all, like 20 plus years ago. It was writing love poems. So that's what the contract was for. And so I'm writing these love poems, and I'm sending them to my editor, Judy Klain at Little Brown, and she's now at Simon & Schuster, but she said, Kwame, I love this poem you wrote about your grandmother. And I had included a recipe, you know, and she said, ooh, and I love that recipe. Can you tell me more about the story behind the recipe? Maybe you could write a prose piece. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I did that. And she said, oh, Kwame, you wrote a beautiful prose piece. How about you write another one? And she said, well, you got that one recipe. Maybe you should. And so she is a fantastic editor. I cannot take credit for figuring it out in advance that this book needed to be hybrid. But she nudged me. She pleasantly suggested this direction that I take with the book. And once I got into it, Brooke, then it was like, oh yeah, I get what I'm doing now. I know what I'm doing. This is prose. This is poetry. This is remembrance. This is recipe. This is conversation. This is hybrid. And that was exciting. And that took about 6 months of that back and forth sort of conversation for me to get it, because it was a book of love poems and it wasn't a memoir. But once I started doing all this, then it was like, oh, this is a memoir.
Right. It's really interesting because the book is called Why Fathers Cry at Night. And I'm curious, was that the contractually obligated title in some way? Like, how did it morph into, love poems? And then it's about all of these things, including the end of a marriage and a troubled relationship with your father, troubles with your daughters. So we were curious about how you landed on the title.
Right. I'd written a poem when my oldest daughter, Nandi, was 15, and she's 35 now. So that would have been 20 years ago. And the poem was about her first date, and it was called 10 Reasons Why Fathers Cry at Night. So as the book morphed into this memoir, we were trying to come up with a title, and Judy again suggested, why not call it Why Fathers Cry at Night? It was her suggestion. I started off writing these love poems as a father, as a way to sort of show my daughters how their father loved, how he maybe succeeded at it, how he failed at it. Sort of the driving factor behind this was, let me share with Nandi and Samaya how I love, so that they can know me, they can get to know me, they can, I wished I could have asked my mother questions. She passed away in 2017. There are things I wanted to know. Did she and my father hold hands? Things I wanted to know, and there are questions I was too afraid to ask my father. So that was sort of the motivation. Well, let me write about who I am and who I was and who I hope to be, so my daughters don't have to ask that question. And so as I began to do that, I began to explore my history and my origins and how I got shaped and molded into the person I am. And that required me to begin to write no longer as a father, but as a son. And that was exciting. So the book just kept evolving you all into these new places. And I just went where it went and hoped that it was going to, flow.
I love that. I love how it started out as kind of an unintentional memoir, with that first nudge from your editor. And I'm guessing she didn't have a grand vision for it either. She just saw an opportunity for this, I guess, evolution of the story.
I don't know, Grant. I think she did. I just think she didn't tell me. I think she sort of piecemealed it to me, but I think she knew maybe what I needed and when I needed it and how I needed it. Because I think had she said that from the beginning, I would have been intimidated.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I've never had that. It sounds like a great way to have a door opened for a new form, especially. And I'm curious because I remember once you told me that your brother and sister had brought up a subject to you that they weren't included in the memoir. And I realized at that moment that my brother and sister aren't included in my memoir, and so I paused to think about that. And the fact is that they're just not part of this part of my story that I'm telling. I'd be forcing them into it. But that said, you were talking about how this memoir ended up including a lot of stuff with your dad in particular, both questions and scenes. And I think the question for every memoirist, or it is for me, is like, who's going to read this and how is this going to change our relationship, if they read it? And do I want them to read it? And so I'm just curious, the whole phrase, like dance like no one's looking, you can't really do that with memoir because somebody's going to read it. And so I'm curious what happened when your father read it.
Well, y'all, fortunately or unfortunately, I danced like no one was looking because I didn't know I was doing a memoir.
Yeah.
So by the time I got to the point where this was a bona fide memoir, it was too late. And I had already sort of, psychologically distanced myself from everything you just said. Ooh, should I let them read it? Ooh, who am I talking about? Like, I just didn't think about it. It wasn't even a thought. Mm-hmm. So the book was published in May of 2023 or 23. And February of 2023, I got the galleys. And I said, oh, let me send it to my family.
Nice.
Right? And so that was the moment where I said, oh, this book is coming out in 3 months. And I remember, here's how it happened. I had a panic attack. And I called Judy and I said, we can't publish this book. She said, why? I said, because I've put too much of myself out there and I've talked about all these people. And I didn't even talk to them. They didn't even know I was doing this. And she said, well, first of all, the book is at the printer. So that ain't going to happen. And she sort of talked me off my ledge and I sent everyone galleys. So I didn't deal with any of that until 3 months before. And then I got all kinds of responses from, why didn't you talk about me? I hate the way you talked about mommy. I'm not reading it. And my father's response was, his first response was, I read your little memoir. Mm. And that was in February. And maybe May, I was on Fresh Air with Terry Gross. Mm-hmm. And she went hard on him. And I couldn't really be upset because I sort of wrote the book about it. So, but I was kind of defensive and we had this back and forth. But I just knew my father was listening and he was going to hate it. Mm. And the biggest thing was, I talked about, he never said, I love you. And that became sort of a through line. And I remember him texting me and saying, that's probably one of the best interviews you've ever done. And then he wrote this was like 11:30 at night, this long text message with a bunch of emojis. Like he figured out how to use emojis. And he said, when I was in the Air Force in my 20s, my parents had never said they loved me, but I knew my mother loved me because she wrote me a letter every week. And it was a big deal to get a letter on base. Mm-hmm. And he said, I knew my father loved me because he bought the stamps in the envelope for his wife. He said, when you get to this place, Kwame, called the by and by, you'll understand how you were loved and that you were loved. Until then, if you need to hear it, I love you.
Wow.
So we had gone from February to June, and that became the beginning of a whole new type of relationship with this man.
Wow. That's so powerful and speaks to sometimes these positive outcomes that happen when you're scared of putting your work out into the world, because so often people are getting ahead of all their fears. So thanks for sharing that. It's powerful. Well, to continue on a bit about your father, he was a Baptist preacher of Black liberation theology, and he assigned these books to you. And earlier on, you talked about loving to go down to the garage, but you also had a fraught early relationship with books. And given that it was kind of a circuitous path to becoming a writer, but I'm curious, when did you start to see yourself as a writer and really say yes to yourself as a writer?
Again, Brooke, I think he says it pretty blatantly. He says, Kwame, your mother and I decided that you were going to be an experiment. And so I don't know if it's circuitous. I think it's a linear path. You can look at Fox and Socks that my mother read to me, and Spin a Soft Black Song by Nikki Giovanni that she read to me at age 3. You can look at my father going to Safeway grocery store to get Funk and Wagnall's encyclopedia and then making me read it. You can look at him taking me to the London book fair when I was 13 to sell books, because my father was a publisher also, to sell books, to stand behind the table at the trade show and sell books. You can look at all these things that I was forced to do, right? Like, what 13-year-old wants to do that? I want to play Atari. And, I want to be outside playing games. I want to be with my friends. So you can look at all these things that I that I did not particularly want to do. And then you can look at the fact that I've written 46 books.
Right.
And you can say there is a direct line between all of that preparation that these two human beings, these beautiful parents did to say, oh, well, that's why he is who he is. And that's how he got where he got. I see it as a straight line now, and I appreciate it. But yeah, probably the first 25 years of my life, I didn't appreciate it at all. I found it to be burdensome and annoying and frustrating and very unfortunate.
Kwame, as someone who says yes, several people in my life who are close to me have been counseling me to say no more, or especially once I start complaining about something I said yes to, which sometimes happens, but I still keep the yes going. But so I'm curious, like on your author website is different than most author websites because you have author, speaker, educator, producer on it, and you're more than that. And so I'm curious, how do you find, because I'm actually, part of the reason I say this is I'm not writing much these days because I'm doing so many other things. And so I'm like not saying yes to my writing, and it's really strange. This is the first time in my life I've been in this position. And so how do you make sure you're finding a balance and saying no to some things so you can keep saying yes to the things you care about?
Well, that's a work in progress, my friend, because genuinely and generally, when I'm asked to do something, my instinct is to automatically say yes. Mm-hmm. It pains me sometimes to say no, to turn something down,
Exactly.
Right.
And so, Brooke, we were talking earlier about I'm an extreme person. And I've found that I've had to adopt a sort of a position that, okay, I am not going to do A. Like, I'm just not going to do it. And so therefore, everything that falls under A, oh, well, I got to say no because I've already decided. So that the bigger thing ain't happening. As an example, I've been on the road since first grade. My daughter was in the first grade. I've been on the road. I must have visited about 1,500 schools and conferences and libraries around the world. And quite a few things I've missed. And she's a senior in high school this year. And we were in Brazil for spring break last March. And I told her, and I said, look, I'm coming off the road next year. You're a senior. I'm coming off the road. I've canceled all my travel. And she was like, Dad, really? I'm like, yeah. She's like, Dad, she said, first of all, how are you going to make money? I said, Chuck, I'm good. We're good. But she said, that's so extreme. How about you just are home more? I was like, no, I'm coming off the road. And so she's like, I'll believe it when I see it. So school started right after Labor Day, and I am home. I am home every day. And so I got tested. It was like the universe said, we're going to see how serious you are. Mm-hmm. I got tested. I don't write for money, but I know my value and I know my worth, and I have to make a living. And I got invited to speak at some place. Mm. It was some serious, what do they say? It was some serious dough, man.
You wanted to say yes.
The colleges this kid's applying to, yeah, that would have been just right on time. And I didn't talk to anybody in the family about it. I just thought about it. I tried to figure out how I could do it, how I could get there, how I could come back, and it was just impossible. And finally, I told my booking agent no, and it was easier for me to get to that point because I had already decided I was going to be home. Mm-hmm. And so that was sort of the big heading, and all the subheadings they're just going to be no's. So I find it easy now to say no because I've made that decision. And I find that I'm happier, and I'm able to sort of spend more time, not just with my writing, but with her.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. Drawing some hard boundaries. While you were telling that story, I was like, it was excruciating. I was like, I totally felt the yes in my mind. Like, I can make an excuse to get out of the house for 24 hours, right?
Hey, look, I will say this. When Oprah calls and says she wants to interview me, I will be going to that.
An exception to every rule.
But because of my extreme way of thinking, this kid will be out of school that day, and she will be coming with me.
Yeah, good.
There you go. Thank you, Kwame. It's awesome to have you on. Good to see you.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Grant. Appreciate you all.
Absolutely. Always get an injection of say yes when I talk with you.
We'll be right back with today's book trend.
Brooke, we once joked that we could feature an AI issue every week as a book trend because it continues to influence writing and publishing in a whole bunch of ways. And it seems like every week, in fact, that another AI issue pops up, to the point that I think we should maybe hire a special AI reporter to cover this beat. But one of the biggest events happened recently, and we're still following this to see what happens. The Anthropic settlement was big news in September when Anthropic agreed to pay $1.5 billion to avoid, worse or further damages. And this is a class action suit, which means that the three authors named in the suit, Andrea Bartz, who we've had on this podcast, Charles Graeber, and Kirk Wallace Johnson, are representing thousands of authors whose books were allegedly copied by Anthropic. Allegedly is the legal term there because Anthropic is actually the company behind Claude, and it's pretty clear that they did take those books. And so Brooke, when this story first came out, I saw a bunch of authors asking on social media what it meant to them. And I initially checked to see if any of my books had been kidnapped, as I'm putting it, allegedly. And indeed, 2 of them had been. And the settlement would require $3,000 to be paid out for each pirated book. So I did what any winner of the lotto does. I purchased cruise tickets and bet the rest of the money on the Cleveland Browns to win this year's Super Bowl. But I don't think it's that simple, is it? And it, of course, wasn't a slam dunk case, and it's still unfolding.
Yeah, it sure is. And interestingly enough, we are recording this episode on the very day that the judge is going to determine next steps here. So the whole thing has been frustrating for authors, needless to say, because it seemed for a minute there that it was tied up. All the judge had to do was approve the terms of the settlement, but that's not what he chose to do. And so here we are in a holding pattern. But I still think it's very important that we're covering this trend as we move into the fall, because authors, you need to be paying attention. What happens in this case will set the tone for what happens with other bigger AI companies like Meta and OpenAI. I did write about this, what authors should do specifically in a Substack early in September, so we'll drop that into the show notes. But what should happen from here is that the judge should rule that Anthropic can do the payout because they've offered to do it. It's like crazy. But there will need to be parameters around who qualifies. And I know that the Authors Guild and other advocacy orgs have been scrambling all month to put together data sets. And that has been a lot of work for something that might not even end up happening.
Well, I think what this means for me, since my copyright is likely owned by the publisher, is that the Cleveland Browns had better win the Super Bowl. Just so everybody knows, it's very unlikely that they will. And I'd better hope that those cruise tickets are refundable. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, everything is up in the air right now. So I think what's been good about watching all this unfold is that it's giving authors a sense of empowerment and agency. That is meaningful, right? Control over something that we did not consent to. By the way, I also have 2 books on the list, 2 kidnapped books, and we don't have any power over it. And so these AI companies just took our copyrighted property and used it. If you're not outraged by this, you should be. Another thing that's come to light through all of this too, though, Grant, is just how many publishers did not file for copyright or don't file for copyright. Because if you didn't file for copyright under the parameters of the deal, you don't qualify for the settlement. And so a lot of authors have been distraught to learn that they do not qualify because their publisher dropped the ball on copyright. Notably, perhaps this is another trend, Macmillan has agreed to pay its authors $1,500 each for any book that qualifies for the settlement for which they did not file copyright. So it's interesting because there's just these side scandals going on and the whole thing is pretty messy.
Yeah. We'll pay you 50% of what you were going to get if we'd done our job, right?
Right.
I'm going to start doing that. It sounds like you're still getting something, it sounds like a gift. But yeah, this is yet another lesson for me to, and that's all I think is, to cherish the journey of writing, and that the journey is the payoff, not a settlement from afterpick. But that said, I want authors like me and you to get their due, especially if their publisher dropped the ball. And I read this quote the other day on Instagram from Toni Morrison. She said, "Struggling through the work is extremely important, more important to me than publishing it." And I believe that. And at the same time, I believe in authors getting paid. We generally always get paid less than we deserve to be paid. So that's why we're here, to help you write your story your way, to feel the creative passion Toni Morrison does, and to publish it if that's what your goal is, and then to get what you deserve when you publish it. So we'll be watching this, and we hope you will too. And we promise to close this loop or keep giving you updates on this story. But we also promise that we won't make the book trend always about AI. But listeners, please keep listening and pray for the Cleveland Browns.